Un saluto di benvenuto a tutti. Oggi dal Liceo Scientifico Galilei di Pescara chiudiamo la serie di incontri con gli autori in gara dell'edizione 2022 del Premio Asimov. Questo pomeriggio è il nostro gradito ospite il giornalista Paul Sen, che ci parlerà del suo libro Il frigorifero di Einstein, come la differenza tra caldo e freddo spiega l'universo, della casa editrice Bollati Boringhieri. Prima di iniziare questo incontro ringrazio per la loro partecipazione il professor Francesco Vissani, ideatore e coordinatore del Premio Asimov, il professor Carlo Carpello, dirigente scolastico del Liceo Scientifico Galilei di Pescara, la professoressa Doriana Papile e il nostro autore Paul Sen. Lascio adesso la parola per un breve saluto al nostro dirigente scolastico, il professor Carlo Carpello. Prego.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti. In qualità di dirigente scolastico del Liceo Galilei do il benvenuto a tutte le persone collegate e ci accingiamo ad iniziare un nuovo anno con questa bella esperienza del Premio Asimov in cui i ragazzi sono realmente protagonisti. E anch'io mi unisco ai ringraziamenti, ringrazio il professor Vissani e il coinvolgimento che ogni anno propone alla nostra scuola e alle scuole del territorio. Un saluto particolare al professor Paul Sen. Thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate the time you're giving us, to our students, and to talk to them and to answer their questions. Thank you very much. I am sure they will appreciate your book. Buona giornata a tutti e buon lavoro a tutti. Grazie.
Grazie Preside. Il momento di ascoltare adesso il professor Francesco Vissani, che con la sua capacità e il suo entusiasmo ci coinvolge ogni anno in un viaggio fantastico nella divulgazione scientifica, lanciando in ogni edizione la sfida per un approccio diverso, non convenzionale, verso la scoperta e la conoscenza. Prego.
Io ringrazio Rosa prima di tutto e ringrazio la scuola che ci ospita e le altre 250 scuole che stanno partecipando. Ringrazio voi ragazzi, però avevo un piccolo saluto per l'autore di oggi che quindi provo a formulare. So, Paul, you know, the Asimov Prize has grown with the help of many people, and today it counts 10,000 jurors, that is our high school students from all Italy. In the past few days, we have talked about Charles Percy Snow, his famous book, The Two Cultures, and we have recalled that he reminded us that putting artificial barriers between science and humanities can be considered a danger for progress and even for health.
I agree.
So Isaac Asimov is the symbol of respect for culture without any artificial barriers. This is the reason why we named the prize after him. And for the same reason, we are so happy and I'm so honored to conclude this cycle of meeting that we reserved for you, finalists of this 7th edition, and you who are a journalist, an engineer, a filmmaker, and now even a writer. So welcome, Paul, and enjoy.
Thank you very much.
Grazie per gli interventi. È il momento ora di passare la parola alla professoressa Doriana Papile, che coordina il dibattito degli studenti con l'autore. Cara Doriana, trasmetti il nostro benvenuto all'ospite del Porsen e introduci a tutti noi qualche informazione.
Ok.
Oh, I can't hear.
Sorry. So from now, the webinar will continue in English. Welcome, Paul. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Nice to see you all. Great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. So good afternoon to all the students in the high schools. Following our seminar, we're very pleased to host the author of the novel Einstein's Fridge, running from the Asimov Award 2022. I'll just read out a brief bio of Paul Sen, the writer. Paul Sen first encountered thermodynamics while studying engineering at Cambridge University. After graduating, he began a career in television and loves to make films about science and technology. Paul now runs his own production company, and its films have covered topics like computing, chaos theory, quantum physics, and natural history. These include 90-minute feature documentaries like Oak Tree, Nature's Greatest Survivor, which won the prestigious Royal Television Society Award for Best Science and Natural History Program. Einstein's Fridge is Paul's first book, and it grew out of research he did for his films. It is about thermodynamics, one of the most important topics in science. Thermodynamics helps explain everything from the behavior of living cells to the black hole at the center of our galaxy. It also explains why we must eat and breathe, how we power our homes, and even helps us build the internet. Thermodynamics inspired many great scientists like Einstein, and it remains at the forefront of research. Paul hopes his book will make more people in the general public aware of this very important branch of science. Let's welcome Paul Sen, who's here today to answer some of the questions and curiosities of our students. Okay, so we have some questions from our students. The first is from Giacomo.
Hi there.
My first question isn't not my personal question. In fact, it's from Viola Sassa from Scientific High School in Varese. And she asked, what are the differences between theoretical and experimental physics in the approach to thermodynamics?
Okay, I think the short answer to that question is it has changed a great deal over time, because when thermodynamics started, it was a very practical science. It was like, how do you make a steam engine more efficient? How can I go a further distance in a steamship using less coal? And the people who were building these machines, they didn't really think of physics as we think of it today. They weren't mathematically trained. Many of them were very practical people. And I think as more and more mathematically trained people became involved in trying to answer these questions, it was something of a surprise that complicated mathematical ideas could actually help with these very practical issues to do with making engines more efficient or more powerful, things like that. And so I think that in the early days, there was no difference, I think, between theoretical and experimental physics. The people were all the same. Some of them did equations, they did their own experiments, often in their own houses. So it was a very sort of interlinked world. But then over the next 100 years, as people found that mathematics was more and more powerful in helping to understand these questions that thermodynamics raised, it soon became much more than just about steam engines. It became about how materials change, how ice and steam are formed, how chemical reactions take place. And as more and more complicated sort of areas of science became involved in thermodynamics, I think there was a division, a splitting up of the two. And some people, and the mathematics became more difficult, so people had to really be trained in that, and then the physical experiments became more complicated, and that required more specialism. But ultimately, I think it's in thermodynamics, practice and theory are still very, very closely linked. You can't have one without the other. And the theoreticians raise questions which the practical people try and solve, and then the experimental physicists come up with results that they can't readily explain. They go back to the theoreticians, and so there's this very complicated back and forth process that goes on. And in some cases, in very modern developments, there's quite a big gap, I would say, between theory and experiment. And the most obvious example is when people try and understand black holes in space. And so there's a lot of debate about the role of thermodynamics and how they behave, but you can't study those practically. We can't yet take a spaceship to a black hole and examine it directly. So there are some areas of thermodynamics where there's a huge gap between theory and practice. But in general, I would say that as a branch of physics, theory and practice are very closely interlinked in thermodynamics.
And now my personal question.
Yeah.
So Thomson had transformed a cooling iron bar into a metaphor for the universe. Is this possible then by observing simple physical systems accessible to us to make hypotheses and conjectures about the behavior or nature in the universe? And what other example can be mentioned?
So I think this is a really interesting question. And I think that everyday observations of the world around us are absolutely crucial to science. All of science begins with observing things that all of us can see or feel or hear in the world around us. So your school is named after Galileo, is that right? Anyway, so the famous story of Galileo, which I don't know if it's true, perhaps you can tell me if it's true, but the story we hear is that he went to the top of the Tower of Pisa and he dropped two objects of different weights to see which one would reach the ground first. And of course, it's a very, very simple question. If you take two objects of different size, different mass, I'm trying to get my hands in the picture, and one's heavy, one feels very light, and you drop them, which one will hit the ground first? Now, you don't need to have any scientific training to understand that question or ask that question. But somebody like Galileo could look at that question and use it to begin, almost, you could say, it was one of the most important observations in the history of science, that he realized that actually, if there was no air, the two objects land on the ground at exactly the same time. And this very, very simple question about how do things fall, has been absolutely fundamental to the way physics has developed, the way technology has developed. And but you don't have to go back in history for these sorts of examples. I mean, there's a very famous example of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein once said that he had what he called his happiest thought. And his happiest thought was a very simple one, again, a very everyday observation, which he said, if I fall off the roof of a building, what happens to my weight? As I'm falling, do I weigh anything? And he thought, well, if I'm falling, I become weightless, my weight disappears. And that he realized that explaining that observation, and it's just a very simple idea. What happens to you when you fall? What happens to your weight? Does it stay the same, or does it disappear? And in trying to answer that question, he came up with what we now call the general theory of relativity. And so from that question, it led to these incredible revolutionary ideas that completely changed our understanding of gravity. It led us to discovering black holes. It's part of the reason we can build a GPS in your car that works accurately. So again, I think there's many, many examples of simple observations of the everyday world. What happens to you when you fall off a roof? Why does a hot cup of tea, if you leave it, why does it always become cooler and end up as the same temperature as the room? These are very simple observations. You know, why does light travel in straight lines? You know, but these are the bedrock, the foundational questions of modern physics. So I think it's absolutely crucial that we keep looking at the world around us and asking questions about it.
Okay, thank you. That seems very interesting. Let's go on. Let's move on to the next question. Emanuele Caputa.
Yes, my question is, the laws of thermodynamics were a triumph during the Industrial Revolution. So how has the studies on heat led mankind to economic progress?
Okay, so I think what's really interesting about that question is that economic progress and science are have a very complicated relationship. So I think what's interesting about thermodynamics is the economic progress almost came before the science. So as I said earlier, people have been building steam engines for like 100 years, but the people who built them didn't really understand the physics behind the way they work. And so thermodynamics grew out of trying to make these steam engines better. So the economic progress was beginning to happen thanks to the technology. That economic progress then motivated scientists to try and understand heat in a more deep and profound way. And then it led them to all these discoveries about the nature of energy. They came up with this very important quantity in modern physics, entropy. But all of that came as almost as a response to the economic progress that the Industrial Revolution was bringing. But then the science kind of fed back to the economic progress, because once people began to understand thermodynamics more clearly, once they began to understand what energy is, what entropy is, that then led to more technical innovation. I mean, the most dramatic is the discovery or the building in the late 19th century of refrigerators. So once people understood thermodynamics and they thought, well, this is a way of making an engine better, they then realized you could kind of use the same principles to make things cold as well. You don't just have to burn heat and make cars move or whatever. You can also come up with technologies like refrigeration, and that's had that then spurred further growth, because once people had refrigerators, it greatly improved human health and nutrition and many other things. We could go on. It's a very important invention, the refrigerator. And then then came then the next thing was with electricity. When electricity became commonplace and people started building having electric light in their homes, scientists then began to go, well, what is the relationship between the energy you put into a light bulb and the light that comes out of it? And that led to quantum physics. So there's this constant back and forth. I think that economic progress and scientific discoveries, they're equal partners in progress. Then one doesn't necessarily cause the other, but they influence each other hugely. That.
Thank you.
Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Hello.
So I would like to ask, the revolutionary France considered science and mathematics effective weapons for the war on superstition and against the power of aristocracy. How do you see the role of scientific subjects in European schools?
Well, I think the science is more important than ever, and it's I think the last 2 years have taught us that it's more important than ever that the general public have science is absolutely part of everybody's education, and this is especially true in democracies, right? Because in what we've really begun to see, and the pandemic is a very good example, but there's other issues like climate change and general health policy, but governments are now making more and more decisions based on science, on what the science should or shouldn't do according to science. And if the ordinary people in a country, the citizens, the voters in the country, are to try and properly, decide who to vote for in elections, they should have a way of assessing how good the politicians are when it comes to making decisions about science. So I think the French Revolution was very, the revolutionaries were, it was a complicated story, the French Revolution, but the commitment to bring science to more people, which was a really important part of the revolutionary ethos in France in that time, is still a really important one. And I think that as we go in, as more and more science and politics and science are now completely connected, so it's more and more important than ever that everybody has a decent education in science so that they can become a properly informed member of a democracy. Oh, I can't hear you. I've lost the sound, sorry. Oh, okay.
Good afternoon. You claim in the book that theoretical physics was born with the rule of causes. How rigorous is the approach based on logic and mathematical observation for the demonstration of results in physics?
Well, I think Clausius is a very interesting figure because I think he you could call him, I think it's fair to call him the father of theoretical physics. So before him, physicists didn't really see themselves as being either one or the other. So, I mean, they all did experiments, they all did, theoretical work, mathematical work to try and understand their experiments. And I think that Clausius really understood that you can use thought experiments. You can bring enormous insight into a physical problem that they're trying to solve simply by applying logic. And I think it is a very rigorous, and if it's done properly, it's an incredibly rigorous and helpful way of advancing knowledge. So again, I mentioned Einstein a bit earlier. I mean, Einstein was a theoretical physicist. I mean, he actually had a much closer relationship with experimental and observational physicists than perhaps his reputation has. But he used what the famous, in English they call them thought experiments, where he asked himself these really sort of very logical questions about like the famous one he apparently did as a young man was, he said, if I'm holding a mirror in front of me, imagine a mirror here, and if I'm holding a mirror in front of me and I'm moving at the speed of light, what will happen to my reflection? Will my reflection stay in the mirror or will it disappear? And by trying to answer that question just by logic alone, it took him a long way towards what we now know as the theory of special relativity. And so I think if it's done properly and done rigorously, logic and mathematics is absolutely vital to physics. But having said that, it's always important that when if you have an amazing idea, which is a theoretical idea, that at some point somebody can actually do an observation or an experiment to see if that idea is actually true in the real world. And I think, I have read criticisms that in modern physics, some of the theories that people think about are so far removed from what we can actually observe or measure in a laboratory that they become somewhat, not pointless exactly, but somewhat sort of esoteric, if that's the right word. So I think I think logic and mathematics is absolutely fundamental. It really pushes the boundaries of knowledge. But we should always remember that it's only true in the end if there's a physical observation or a measurement in the laboratory that confirms that. sort of mathematical reasoning.
Thank you, Paul. That was very interesting too. Now we have Maria Clara Danese that would like to ask you a question.
Yeah. The book examines the twofold contribution that heat has given to physics and to the socioeconomic context. In your opinion, how useful is thermodynamics for our human life?
Well, I think it's really important. I mean, that's kind of the reason I wanted to write a book about it, because I felt that of all the branches of physics, it really does sort of explain really basic things about, you know, why do we eat? You know, what is the purpose of nutrition? Why, you know, or if you look at modern society, you know, when we think of energy, you know, this concept of energy, which is so important to modern life, you know, with whether it provides electricity or in our homes, or whether it moves us around in our cars or whatever, you know, we're very familiar with this idea. And I sort of felt people sort of don't really understand how deep and profound an idea it is in the whole of science. So I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier about, especially in a modern democracy, that people should have a decent or basic scientific education. And I think thermodynamics is absolutely, and I'm not expecting, you know, people to study high level, you know, black hole event horizon thermodynamics and all that, but a basic idea of the laws of thermodynamics, which is, you know, which are quite simple to state. You know, the first one is that you probably all study this, which is known as the conservation of energy, which is this idea that energy cannot be destroyed, it can only be changed. I mean, even that idea alone, if people have a grasp of it, you begin to see how so many aspects of the modern world, you know, what really drives them, what really makes them happen the way they do. And I think as a society, as we become more and more technologically advanced, you know, these questions about energy and the nature of energy, how do we get it, what do we do with it, how do we deal with the waste, all these things are going to be very, very become even more important than they are now. And they're going to affect us in very surprising ways. And I think that the example I like to think of with that is the internet. So when people were first building the internet, they didn't really think that it had anything to do with thermodynamics, right? The internet was all about computers and connecting computers and microchips and all that kind of stuff. But as we've grown it, as the internet has become this huge thing, and now everybody all over the world uses it with smartphones and all the rest of it, you know, we're now beginning to realize that the energy required to keep it going is huge. And we have to figure out where this energy will come from. We're also trying to work out what to do with the enormous computers, these huge server farms that enable, like the conversation we're having now probably, but enable Google and WhatsApp and all the famous companies of the internet. You know, they generate enormous amounts of heat, and we have to work out what to do with that heat. How do we make computers better? Because the chips are now themselves becoming so hot that the biggest problem in one of the big problems in modern computing is keeping them cool and stopping them melting. So I think that the central nature of the basic science of thermodynamics is absolutely sort of undeniable. And as we become more and more technologically advanced as a society, which I think we are, it will become even more important. And I think a basic understanding of its principles is just a really useful thing for people to have.
Thank you. That was very interesting, Paul. Our next question is from Elena Lotti. Elena?
Well, some of the greatest discoveries described in the book have occurred accidentally, as with James Maxwell. So, do you believe that today great scientific discoveries originate by chance?
Yes, I do. I think chance is a very important part of science. You know, I think there's a saying, which I can't remember the exact words, but so you have to be lucky, but you have to be aware that you're lucky. So you need things to happen by chance, but then there needs to be people around who are able to see the significance of that chance event. So if you think of, you know, the discovery of penicillin happened, I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, it was a mistake, you know, somebody left a window open in a laboratory and they noticed some strange things were going on in Petri dishes, you know, in the little glass dishes in a biology laboratory. But then Alexander Fleming realized there was something actually quite important here going on. So luck was crucial. I mean, the original observation was just chance. And even more recently, I don't know if you've heard of the Nobel Prize that went for gene editing, which is this extraordinary new you know, idea that we can snip out bits of our DNA and change and alter them, and it's going to, I mean, I think the implications of it, there's enormous moral implications, there's enormous medical implications, but the original work that led to that was not by people going, we're going to try and find a way to edit genes. It was people studying, you know, the behavior of sort of unusual forms of bacteria. For instance, there was some bacteria in Spain that were very good at living in a salty environment. So the people who were studying that were not going, I'm going to discover a new, you know, technology to save the world. They were studying a very kind of, to them, practical problem that was in front of them. But there was the unintentional consequences led many years later to a hugely significant discovery like gene editing. So I think that chance is absolutely always going to be an important part of all of life, especially science. But I think the crucial thing is to have people around who can recognize a lucky break when they see one. You have to, it's not just enough for luck to have, for good luck. You also have to be able to recognize good luck when you see it. And that's quite hard sometimes.
Thank you.
If my answer is long enough, should I speak for longer, shorter? I don't know.
In your book, you mentioned some great women of science, such as Lise Meitner and Emmy Noether, and others who have remained in the shadow of their companions, such as Mileva Maric and Maxwell's wife. So what do you think about the role of women in science in the past and in the present today?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So when you research the history of science, as I did for my book, it becomes really obvious that for a lot of history, men have tried really hard. Men have tried very hard to stop women becoming scientists. So it's not as if, you know, women were just not interested. There was many women throughout history who were very interested and wanted to become scientists, but there was a huge there were huge obstacles to that happening, which were created by men. So some of the, you know, like the famous British scientist, James Clerk Maxwell, you know, who's a brilliant man, you know, he helped, you know, he did huge amounts of work in thermodynamics and electromagnetism. But when he built the first physics laboratory, almost you could say, in England at Cambridge University, and he said, we should not have women students here, even though there were many women who wanted to study and study science. And in my book, I talk about an Austrian physicist called Ludwig Boltzmann. His wife, whose name was Henrietta von Eigenkleur, before she married him, she wanted to be a physicist as well, but she was not able to do so because at that time, women were not permitted to study physics in Austrian and German universities. And Emmy Noether, who she was also not officially allowed to study science because she was a woman. And, you know, it was only because she was so determined that she managed to find a way to do it anyway. And the history of science is full of stories like this. So I think what's really, what you come away from that thinking is human progress has been greatly harmed by this. You know, if men had not been so keen to stop women becoming scientists, we would be much further advanced than what we are now. We have harmed our own progress by this. And I think the good thing is this is not something I know, I don't really, because I don't work directly as a scientist. I speak to a lot of scientists as part of my work as a journalist. I think it's much better now, certainly in the Western world. I think it's more equal, and there's more, it's much, improved since the days of Henrietta Boltzmann and Lisa Meitner, or even who was somewhat later. So I think it's absolutely crucial that more women, are equally represented throughout science. And I think if we make sure that happens, the benefits will come for everybody. It won't just be. So it's not just about fairness and justice. It's also actually about increasing the rate at which we advance as a species, and how much we advance, the speed at which we advance knowledge. Am I speaking too fast? I'm slightly worried that people don't understand.
Why do you think that the statistical approach in the interpretation of thermodynamics has met such great distrust?
Okay, so I think that's a very interesting question as well. I think the reason for that is kind of emotional in a way. I think in the 19th century, people believed, the scientists thought physics was about absolute truth, so they didn't like the idea that. So if you think of the laws of physics that people had before then, there was Newton's laws of motion, and then there was James Clerk Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism. So these were very absolute laws. They weren't true sometimes, they were always true. And then when people began to look at entropy, I don't know if you studied entropy at school, but it turned out that it was something that had a very statistical kind of chance. There was chance, and statistics was a really important part of understanding entropy. And I think people just found it very unsettling that there was a principle that was really important to physics, and yet somehow it was not absolutely true all the time. It was unnerving to people that there might be something that is usually true but not always true. When is it? Then you get into all these questions about when might it not be true? When is it true? And I think people found that just emotionally very unsatisfying. And there was a lot of resistance to these ideas. But in the end, people had to come around to them. They found ultimately that there was no way of escaping the laws of statistics. And I think the really interesting consequence of that was that the statistics that was introduced to physics because of thermodynamics paved the way for what we now call quantum physics. And I'm sure, as people tell you, quantum physics is statistics at the very heart of quantum physics. Quantum physics tells us that the individual particles that make up the world around us we can't know exactly what they're doing. We can estimate probably what they might be doing, but we can't be sure exactly what they're doing. And I think the fact that in the 19th century they'd already encountered scientists that encountered statistics that come into physics, helped pave the way for this big revolution in 20th century physics, which was that not only are statistics important, they're actually fundamental to the building blocks of the universe.
Thank you, Paul. Alicia has a nice question for you.
Okay.
Hi. Why did you choose Einstein?
Oh, hello. I can read it. What? Okay, shall I answer? Yes. Okay, so why did I choose Einstein's Fridge as the title? Well, I thought that, see, Einstein is a very well-known name, and he brings, and people have a huge amount of interest in everything everything his work and his incredible work that he did. But I think that what people don't appreciate is that actually he had this other side to his life, which was a very he was interested in very practical questions, and he was very much interested in the role that science could play in society. And I thought it would be just a kind of fun idea to sort of put Einstein in that context, to show that he actually cared about things that were like every part of everyday life, that he wasn't just some professor who lived in an abstract world of theories, that he actually actually cared about the same things that all of us care about. And because fridges are very much to do with thermodynamics, I thought it was just a very catchy way, if that makes sense. It was a very sort of a simple and fun kind of way of attracting people to the subject. Because the problem is thermodynamics, which is a terrible word. It's not a word that sounds interesting to the general public. I think that scientists study it and they are very much interested in it, but outside of the scientific community, if you say the word thermodynamics to most people, they look a bit confused, they look a bit bored almost. So I knew I couldn't put thermodynamics in the title. My publishers didn't really want that. So they wanted another title that captured the essence of what the book was sort of about, which had a bit of mystery and intrigue. And then I came upon this story that Einstein had actually worked on designing a fridge. And so it seemed to me a way of showing that there's serious science here, but also making it more accessible and feel more interesting to ordinary people. Certainly than a book that, if it was called The Story of Thermodynamics, I think people would find that a very unappealing title.
Yes, I think you're right, Paul. I certainly agree with that. Our next question is from Angelo Chiulli.
Hi.
Do you think that Einstein's work at Berlin's patent office influenced him the construction of the refrigerator?
Well, I think I think the answer to that question is yes and no, but not in the way you might think. So when he was at the patent office, and I think this has now been documented in a lot of books, the work he was doing as a patent clerk was very important to his science. So he was based at Bern is in Switzerland, and at the time that Einstein was working there, there was a lot of interest in many European countries, but Switzerland particularly, in creating a synchronized way of creating a kind of synchronized timing system for railways and things like. So how do you make sure that the railways in the country are all have the same time? How do you send signals from one country, from one city to another, and make sure that the timing is correct? And so those sorts of questions about time and how you send time signals through electric currents and radio waves and all that kind of stuff, I think had a huge influence on his work on relativity, which he was doing when he was a patent clerk. He was actually doing the work, the preparatory work for his famous papers on special relativity and famous equation E equals mc squared. So I think his patent office work had a big influence on that. The patent office influenced the fridge, but in a different way. So when Einstein started with his friend Leo Szilard, when he started designing fridges, this was many years later in the 1920s. So he was a patent clerk in the early years of the 20th century, so 1903, 1904, I think, 1905 is when. and he started doing his work on the fridge in the 1920s. So there's a long gap. But what's interesting is that when he and Szilard started designing the fridge, because Einstein had worked in a patent office, he knew how to make the applications for the patent. So he knew how to register the design of the patent with all the different countries in the world so that they would be able to show that it was their design. So he understood the patent system extremely well. And in fact, him and Szilard, his friend who designed the fridge together, they then received a fair bit of income from these patent applications, which Einstein put through as when they were designing the fridge. And there's an interesting end to that story, which is Einstein and Szilard, they both had to flee, run away, or they both had to escape from Germany in the 1930s because of Hitler and the Nazis taking over. Einstein and Szilard were both Jewish. And Szilard actually was able to live on the money he earned from the patent applications that he made, which came from the fridge. And Szilard used that and used the time he escaped to London, actually. And when he was in London, he set up an organization that helped many Jewish academics escape from Germany. So the patent application work that Einstein did had these amazing benefits that we didn't, I don't think anyone would have predicted.
Thank you. Our next question is from Asia Camplona.
Hi, my question is, do you share Einstein and Szillard's idea that science must be useful to society?
I think my answer to that is yes and no. So I think science is always useful to society. And the ways in which science is useful are kind of apparent. We have all the benefits of modern technology, and you take the mobile phone, the internet, the electricity in our homes. All of these are consequences of science, which have made human life much better in many ways. But I also think that it shouldn't only be done. Science should not only be done because it serves society. I think science should also be done for its own sake, because I think science ultimately is a sort of quest for truth. It's us trying to understand how the universe, the world that we live in, we're trying to understand it. We're trying to see how it works. What are the principles that operate behind it? And I think just doing that for its own sake is enough. I don't think we have to always justify, we should only do science because it's useful for, it makes better cars or something like that. I think science should be done for the same reason people do art. People write novels or paint pictures or write poetry. They're not doing it necessarily because it has any practical benefit. They're doing it because it makes the world richer and a more beautiful place to live in. And I think science should be done for that reason also, as well as being useful to society, and it is useful to society. It should also be done for its own sake, because it's a great way for humans to show their creativity, actually, and to try and make sense of where we find ourselves. So yes, it should be useful, but it shouldn't just be done because it's useful.
Okay, thank you. Now we have Valentina Ricci's question.
Do you see that there are other areas in which thermodynamics can inspire new lines of research?
Well, I think, yes, that this is, I think what's been in the last few decades, what's happened is thermodynamics has kind of spread across everywhere. It's like suddenly gone into areas of science that people didn't used to think it was relevant to. And the two great examples are, I mentioned computing and the internet. So I think that as we've sort of reached a position where we're building these amazing computers, but can we keep improving them? And one of the big problems, as I think I just touched on earlier, is that we have to, the computers are becoming too difficult to make because the chips are becoming too hot. And so I think if we're going to really push to if we're going to push computing to new levels of, new heights, thermodynamics is going to be very important in computing research, in trying to design new kinds of computers, new kinds of chips that use energy and dissipate heat in different ways. So I think there's a lot of work being done in that field, and I think the benefits of that have not probably reached us yet, but will, I think by the time you're all my age, it will be there. And the other big area where thermodynamics has become a very, very important factor is, very surprisingly, in cosmology, in the study of, the heavens, if you could say. So I think you've all heard of Stephen Hawking. In the 1970s, he proposed this idea, which is now called Hawking radiation, and it's to do with black holes and the nature of the way these very strange things exist in our cosmos, and using ideas from thermodynamics. Hawking and and another scientist called Jacob Bekenstein were among the first to think, well, actually, thermodynamics is a very useful way of trying to understand these strange objects in space. And since their work in the 70s, what's now known as black hole thermodynamics has exploded. There's a huge amount of theoretical work being done. And some of the ideas that are being discussed in this new kind of cosmology are really, people hope, will shed a great deal of light on the very fundamental nature of space and time. These questions like, we live in a universe of space and time. What are they? Why are they different? Why are they similar? And I think thermodynamics is going to be a very important part of trying to answer questions about space and time.
Okay, let's move on to our last question. Hello.
So my question is, what role of thermodynamics do you see in the science of a very distant future?
Wow, that's there's a famous saying there was a very famous Danish physicist called Niels Bohr, and he once said, I'm very suspicious of predictions, especially when they're about the future. So I'll try and answer that question, probably knowing I'll be wrong. I guess in the very distant future, in a kind of, I think partly in the medium future, it's I'm going to allude back to my previous answer, which is actually, I think thermodynamics will help us revolutionize computing power even further. So let me make a prediction, which maybe I'm sure will be wrong, but there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence and quantum computing and all these new ideas that are in the, perhaps just coming over the horizon, which could have a huge effect on society, machines that can be genuinely intelligent and think and feel like us, maybe. And I think that what I would say is that in the next 50 to 100 years, I think computing will change even more so than it has over my lifetime. I grew up where there was no internet, no mobile phones, nothing, TV, there was no digital anything. And the world's completely changed. And I think it will change again in ways that I can't predict. But I think thermodynamics is going to be a crucial part of that change. And the other thing I would say, even going further, is I think there are a great many mysteries about the universe, which we just don't, we're a long way for answering. So there's these big questions in cosmology to do with things like dark matter and dark energy, and just what and as I said earlier, about what we, why, to take very deep questions about the nature of space and time. Why does time seem to always go into the, why does it have a direction? Why is the future different from the past? And I think we're a long, long way from answering those sorts of questions, but I think one day we'll be closer to answering them. And I think that thermodynamics will be a very important tool in helping us answer them. So I think there'll be some, I guess in summary, I would say thermodynamics will revolutionize computing and make computers even more surprising and powerful than they are. And ultimately, it will help us really answer some of the very basic questions about the fabric of space and time.
Okay, that was great. Thank you, Paul.
I hope that made sense.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for all the interesting information you've given us.
Sorry, I can't.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I said thank you.
It seems to be suddenly become very crackly. Oh.
I was saying thank you for your inspiring talk. And
yeah. So I'm struggling to hear you now for some reason. Shall I turn this?
Microfono. Hello?
Hello? Shall I mute my microphone?
Paul, can you hear me? We'd like to thank you for your inspiring talk and information. I hope all the schools that have joined us have also enjoyed the seminar. And now our colleague Rosa and Francesco would like to say a few words. And then our headmaster, Professor Carlo Cappello. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Bene, ringraziamo ancora Paul Sen per il suo intervento e per la disponibilità. Prima di chiudere, vuoi dire qualche altra cosa? Un ultimo saluto a tutto il popolo di Premio Asimov?
Sì, ringrazio tutti, ringrazio gli autori e vedo che però hai pronti dei bellissimi ringraziamenti, tu quindi lasciate la parola.
Siamo giunti ormai al termine. Prima di lasciarci vorrei ringraziare Francesco Vissani, il nostro dirigente Carlo Cappello per averci ospitato, la professoressa Doriana Papile per il suo valido aiuto e le professoresse Lara Bianchini, Flavia Forindi, Assunta Di Vacri, che dalle retrovie mi hanno dato una grande mano per la realizzazione di questo incontro. Ringrazio tutto il personale della scuola e della segreteria, in particolare la signora Antonella Di Renzo, per il supporto tecnico. E non da ultimo la regia di Fabrizio Ursini, che ha avuto tanta pazienza e è stato molto bravo. Il ringraziamento più grande va al Premio Asimov, all'INFN, l'Associazione Italiana Librai e tutti i ragazzi che hanno partecipato oggi e tutti i ragazzi che nelle diverse parti d'Italia hanno scelto di leggere un libro di questa edizione. E vi auguro una buona serata ed una buona lettura a tutti voi. Grazie per averci ascoltato e per aver passato un po' di tempo con noi. Grazie a tutti.